Let's instead move on to some discussion about the basics of crisis assessment and intervention. I think it's worth noting that there's a lot of different schools of thought about treatment writ large. With the nuances of intervening when folks are in crisis, it's a little more direct in some spots. So sometimes, a person comes to see you for help, consultation, a general meeting of some kind, and it's very evident that something's wrong. And you usually have some basic stuff to concern yourself with here. One or two things, like first, assessing for safety, for their sake and for yours, and two, making sure that you can get them to a place that they are stable or calm enough that you can actually do a comprehensive assessment of sorts. And I sometimes begin with a review of interviewing skills when I'm teaching this stuff, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that because it gets to be a bit redundant with a group of clinicians that have been working in the field for some time. I do just want to offer up a reminder about the importance of being human, which I don't think I have to remind you too much about that. I think most folks in this profession lean more toward the humanistic side than anything. But I do think that a lot of folks in our profession, we forget to be human beings sometimes. If a person comes into your office and something horrible has just happened, they just found out that their father died in a car crash, I think it's totally acceptable to respond with something like, "Oh no, that's terrible." Like, I think there's to respond with, "Oh, how does that make you feel?" or something very generic and therapist-y like that. I think is something you want to avoid. The only reason I mention that is that I think Linehan talked a lot about this in some regards, that there has been within the last 60 years since the Gloria tapes came out, a sort of a push toward the archetype of the therapist, right? That everybody sort of acts and talks a lot like Carl Rogers. It's baked into the skills training books that they give to folks in graduate programs, and some of it's very sensible. But again, I think if we're all speaking in very slow and reasoned, gentle nods and things like that, it can be a little off-putting for some. But again, a reminder about being yourself, I think, is partly what I'm trying to advocate for there. APA tried to do an update on the Gloria tapes about 10 years ago, where they had three of. If you watch the original Gloria tapes, where you have Fritz Perls, Albert Ellis, and Carl Rogers, their individual personalities are very apparent. The APA version came out just a few years ago. They had Judy Beck, the guy that did EFT, and I don't even remember the other person because they all looked and talked exactly the same. There was no individual style that seemed to come out through that, which was kind of a bummer. Yeah. So that aside, remembering some of the basics of interviewing skills and making sure that you're being very human about this and not keeping your posture and presentation too rigid or unnatural. Reminder about silence. I often say it's the most over or underused techniques, particularly in developing clinicians. Either you're terrified of it or you become so enamored of it as a cool technique that you overdo it. There was somebody that wrote about this. I'm remiss to suggest this because I lost the citation, but I'm fairly certain I know this to be a fact that somebody had sussed out in a study some time ago. Pauses of, I think it was 10 to 15 seconds or more seem to have an impact on rapport development. In that when we had dialogue pauses that went beyond just a few seconds, it made the therapist seem a bit more cold and distant, which is not surprising. If you were ever out to coffee or beers with one of your friends and they said something to you and then you just stared at them and nodded gently for 15 seconds, it's a long time. So again, don't be so much of a therapist that you forget to be a human being. If a client needs to cry, let them cry. Don't just stare at them all creepy after they tell you something heavy. So we have a person in our office that's in bad shape, or we are in the office with a student and their parents, and the dad is starting to raise his voice because he's mad about what his daughter's doing or something like that. I'm trying to come up with some scenarios here. How do we help any of these folks to calm down so we can help them to help themselves a bit? This is where I usually had a clip here. I won't show it for you just because, again, copyright concerns, etc. If you've ever seen the movie Captain Phillips, I think it's free on Netflix right now. Again, that's not a plug for Captain Phillips. It's just that there's this one clip. I won't spoil the film for you, but the last couple of minutes of the film, Tom Hanks, the protagonist in this particular film, just went through this tremendous trauma not more than 10 minutes ago. He thought he was going to die, saw a bunch of other people die, and now he's meeting with the first responder. And it's in the last couple of minutes of the film. But if you ever get a chance to check it out, it's interesting. when they filmed this, the way that they filmed it was that they had an actual first responder come in and just do her job. So in that scene, when you watch it, Tom Hanks is acting, but she isn't. And it's interesting to watch, what a first responder does in all of this and sort of determine for yourself, like, as you watch that, would that work for you? If you were Tom Hanks in this situation where you're, in the middle of your own trauma and this person responds in that fashion, would it help or would it not? Her response, if you watch, is that she's very reasoned and measured and very diligent in her approach here. I'm here to answer questions about X. I don't have anything else for you here. Let me hold on, pause. Just tell me, are you okay? Are you breathing? Stay calm. For some folks, I think that could work like gangbusters. For other folks, that could be a bit of a barrier to success. So some of the techniques that are worth noting here, either with regard to that clip that I can't show or just in general. First technique is showing understanding. Oh, I'm sorry, Daniel. It's called Captain Phillips. Again, in the interest of conflict of interest, I'm not hired by the folks at Paramount Pictures or anything like that. It's just supposed to be It was a good movie, I think, but it was more the scene itself was what I was referencing. Showing understanding. Remember, you have to be careful that you are showing understanding, not saying you understand. Because again, the way that works is I would try your best to excise "I understand" from your vocabulary. And I would say that for two reasons. One, because to say "I understand," if you're not careful, sometimes with me and my approach, I feel like sometimes that can come across as a little condescending. Like, "Oh, I understand" should come with like a gentle head pat or something like that. Yes, but second, thank you, Alexis. Second, it's I want to remember that I don't understand. Like, I want to try to keep that in the front of my brain throughout my entire interaction with this person, that I don't understand. I'm trying to understand. Next up, modeling calm behavior. It's a little tricky as well because you have to be able to read the individual. In some cases, that's going to work very well. And in other cases, not so much. I remember a number of years ago, I had a medical procedure where I was under twilight sedation, and I remember, the nurse that was attending to me, she, gave me this like analgesic whatever on my throat, and I started to choke, and I started to freak out a little bit. And I remember she put her hand on my shoulder and said, "It's okay, Charles, you're going to be fine." And it was worked so well. Like, I love that. But the opposite to that, I remember a long time ago, one of the first gigs a lot of folks get in mental health is working in residential treatment facilities. And I was no different. And I remember the Cornell method was the method that they taught at the time. And when you were working with kids in like lockdown facilities like we were, the mantra was, the louder they get, the more upset they get, the quieter and the calmer you get. The more yelling and screaming they are, the more you have to be relaxed and calm and together. And I think what a lot of us found is that for a majority of folks, that didn't work very well, because if they're upset, yelling and screaming, and then my response is just calm down, just knock it off, you're going to be fine, or not knock it off or something to that effect. It's a mismatch. We're not aligned. It's almost as if they're telling me I'm very upset, and my response is, well, you're not supposed to be, and here's why. And that doesn't usually work very often. But again, you have to know the person. For some folks, that could work very well. For others, it can feel very invalidating to some extent. And then the question becomes, well, then what do you do instead? Do you shout back and get upset with them? Not necessarily. There were some approaches to treatment that I've worked with over the years where that was the recommended intervention, but I don't know that I would suggest that that's the best way to go here. Regardless, these are you have a lot of different places that you can run with this. Reassuring, that's another tricky one. Is it okay to tell your client that everything is going to be okay? I mean, no, and that we can't really offer guarantees to anybody about anything. But still, there is a very human element to this. Like, one of the greatest things that a lot of folks probably remember from childhood was having something terrible happen and then getting reassurance from a parent that everything would be okay eventually. That's always a nice thing to hear if you can hear it from somebody genuinely. There was a story that Jerome Frank told in one of his books that I thought was pretty good, where he talked about being on a golf course, and he saw a gentleman have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. So he was a physician. He ran over, and he saw as they were attending to him, he was hooked up to all the machines and he could read all of his vitals. And it was a friend of his. And his friend looked up and said, "Jerome, am I okay? Am I going to die?" And Jerome looked at his vitals and saw that they were all over the place. And he said to him, "Oh, no, you're fine. This is minor. It's nothing. You're going to be okay. We'll be out of the hospital in a day." And then watched as all of his vitals went right back to normal as soon as he had told him this lie. Again, I'm not advocating for that, but more just suggesting that there is something to that. To have some sort of a reassurance of our safety can be have healing properties in and of itself. And then encouraging talking of all the things that we're covering here. It's probably the one of the least harmful and least controversial. If we can at least get them to start, not getting so stuck in their own heads, we're potentially getting somewhere. The only thing that I would encourage you to avoid, I don't know if anybody's familiar with critical incident stress debriefing. For folks that are in crisis, there used to be this conceptual logic that the best way to help people who are in crisis is to have them process what's going on as soon as we can. And the idea being that we want to do the work, so to speak, at the front end rather than at the back end. And they did that for a while. It was like a lot of hospitals, Fortune 500 companies, when they would have like large scale crisis events, like a bunch of people working in an ER and something horrible happens. After the horrible thing happens, they bring in the crisis intervention staff, the counselors and whatnot, to come in to do some group work and talk it over with people and send some people home if they're too upset. And what they found when they started evaluating this a little bit better is that it seemed to actually increase the likelihood of post-traumatic stress disorder rather than decrease it. And the reasoning for that, it's hard to say, but I think sometimes we have to be mindful of the fact that human beings have been contending with trauma and loss and death and things like that since we first stepped out of the primordial soup. We have a lot of built-in mechanisms to handle this stuff. And sometimes the best intended interventions can serve more to get in the way rather than to help. Okay, some other ones, using distraction, another one of those that can go either way kinds of examples. To some extent, it's a helpful exercise with the intention, again, to get the client out of their head for a moment or two. They're a jumbled mess of a lot of things at this point. And it can sometimes be helpful to say or do something to break the process. I used to have a colleague of mine who I liked a lot. He had this thing that he would do when he was in the ER and somebody came in and they were in the middle of a psychotic break or something. He would, their first presentation in the ER, he would take their blood pressure. And he could care less about what their blood pressure was, but he found that it was like a familiar exercise that made sense to people. Like there was that, sound of the sphygmometer or whatever it's called. It was sort of like the opposite of like white lab coat syndrome or whatever. There was just something familiar about it. And he used to do the same thing when they would, folks would come in for his their first meeting in his private practice, wherein he would, offer them a cup of coffee because he found there to be something just sort of relaxing about that. It was a familiar thing. Yeah, Larice, the using humor thing, agreed. Especially if you know the person well and they know you. But here's the thing. My general suggestion to folks is to avoid humor because it's one of those things that makes more sense with time, and you can do a lot of damage though if you use it incorrectly. The running joke that I've always said is that some of the worst mistakes in my life have been haircuts and times where I thought I was funny when I wasn't. And again, you have to be very, very cautious about how that stuff is delivered. But good point. I think it can work very, very well.